Ma'am.
Take me where you want to take me.
I can't take you. I
No,
don't
take
have any
me.
identification on
And
me.
I don't care. You don't need identification. You have
I
locked
do.
people up and you have picked up dead bodies when you don't know who bodies it was,
Ma'am.
but you picked them up.
Ma'am.
Take me where you need to take me.
It begins with a chaotic scene outside a nightclub, screaming, confusion, flashing lights, and a woman insisting she was trying to stop violence, not cause it. Minutes later, she's in the back of a police cruiser invoking God, warning officers, and claiming her rights are being violated in real time.
No, he just punched me. Everything for no reason. Right, hold on, serious. Let it go. Let it go. Let it go. Let it go.
That's a cop!
But this isn't just any arrest. The woman in handcuffs is a former judge. What unfolds next is not only a dispute over what happened outside that club in the early hours of the morning, but a much larger legal battle, one that pits a former probate judge against the city of Atlanta and one of its police officers with $50 million on the line. Body camera footage, constitutional rights, qualified immunity, false arrest claims, and allegations of excessive force all collide in a lawsuit that raises a difficult question. Was this a lawful arrest or a profound abuse of power? As criminal charges quietly fall apart and a civil lawsuit takes center stage, this case forces us to examine where authority ends, where accountability begins, and how quickly a single encounter can spiral into years of legal warfare. This is not just about what happened that night, it's about what the law allows and what it doesn't. Let's break it down. It was just after 3 a.m. outside a crowded Atlanta nightclub when chaos spilled into the street. Music thumped inside, but outside shouting, pushing, and confusion took over. What began as a late-night altercation would soon spiral into an arrest that shocked the public, because the woman at the center of it was not an ordinary bystander. She was a former judge. Witnesses later described a heated scene outside the Red Martini nightclub. A man and a woman were involved in a physical confrontation, drawing attention from security and nearby patrons. According to the woman who would soon be arrested, she believed the man was violently assaulting the woman. She claims she stepped in, not to fight, but to stop the violence. In her version of events, she says she briefly grabbed the back of the man's shirt in an attempt to interrupt the assault. She insists she never struck anyone, never threw a punch, and never intended to escalate the situation. She describes her actions as minimal, non-violent, and driven by concern for the victim. But police arriving at the scene saw something very different, or at least that's what the arrest report would later suggest. Body camera footage shows officers moving quickly into the crowd. Voices overlap. Someone yells that a judge has just punched a cop. The scene is chaotic, loud, and fast-moving. Within seconds, the former judge is taken to the ground and placed in handcuffs. She appears stunned. As she is restrained, she repeatedly protests, saying she did nothing wrong. She demands to know why she is being arrested. She insists she was trying to protect someone, not harm anyone. Her voice grows louder, emotional, and increasingly confrontational. "I did not punch anyone," she says. "You are violating my rights," she insists. She is placed in the back of a patrol car where the confrontation continues, not physical now, but verbal and legal. Inside the cruiser, she challenges the officer's authority, accusing him of false imprisonment and malicious prosecution. She repeatedly demands to be told what crime she has committed. At several points, she references constitutional rights, insisting that she is being unlawfully detained. The officer, meanwhile, tells her she is under arrest. What follows is a tense standoff marked by accusations, prayers, and increasingly alarming statements. She claims the officer used excessive force, slamming her to the ground without warning. She alleges that he never investigated what actually happened before arresting her. She refuses to provide her name. Officers repeatedly ask for identification. She claims her ID is in her purse, which fell to the ground when she was taken down. She says officers refuse to let her retrieve it. From the officer's perspective, she is being uncooperative. From her perspective, she is being deliberately silenced. Minutes turn into hours. She remains in the back of the patrol car, continuing to protest her detention. She claims she is not under arrest. She claims she is being punished, not investigated. She says the detention serves no lawful purpose. At one point, her language becomes deeply religious. She prays aloud, invokes God, and accuses the officer of acting under demonic influence. Then comes a statement that will later circulate widely online. The last person who ever tried me like this died 30 days later. I pray for you. The moment is disturbing, intense, and unforgettable. Eventually, she is transported for booking. The tension escalates again as officers attempt to process her. She resists physical guidance, insisting she can walk on her own. She accuses officers of assault. She refuses again to give her name unless specific individuals, whom she claims are connected to law enforcement, are contacted. Despite the chaos, she is ultimately booked. Police charge her with simple battery and felony obstruction, alleging she struck an officer during the incident. The charges are serious and carry significant legal consequences, but the story does not end there. In the weeks that follow, something unexpected happens. The charges begin to fall apart. Reports later indicate that at least some of the charges were dismissed for lack of prosecution. Whether due to procedural issues, evidentiary problems, or prosecutorial discretion remains unclear. What is clear is this: the criminal case does not move forward as initially expected. And then comes the next chapter. The former judge files a massive civil lawsuit, not through an attorney, but representing herself. She names the city of Atlanta and the arresting officer as defendants. The amount she seeks is staggering, more than $50 million. Her claims go far beyond a single bad night. She alleges false arrest, excessive force, unlawful detention, malicious prosecution, and violations of her constitutional rights. She claims the officer lacked probable cause, used unreasonable force, and detained her for hours without justification. She also accuses the city of Atlanta of publicly releasing body camera footage in a misleading way, portraying her as a violent offender before any judicial determination had been made. She claims this damaged her reputation, career, and standing in the community. And that reputation matters, because long before this arrest, she had already been removed from her judicial position by the Georgia Supreme Court for unrelated misconduct, raising questions about credibility, pattern of behavior, and public trust. Now those two worlds collide: a former judge, a chaotic arrest, dismissed charges, and a multi-million-dollar lawsuit that forces one central question: was this an unlawful arrest or a lawful response to a volatile situation? That question sits at the heart of everything that follows. After the criminal charges quietly began to unravel, the story took a dramatic turn, one that shifted the spotlight from a chaotic nightclub arrest to a courtroom battle with massive implications. Instead of preparing for trial as a criminal defendant, the former judge went on the offensive. She filed a civil lawsuit seeking more than $50 million, naming the arresting officer and the city of Atlanta as defendants. Most striking of all, she chose to represent herself. No legal team, no intermediaries, just her claims, and a detailed narrative accusing law enforcement of serious constitutional violations. At the center of her lawsuit is one core allegation: she was arrested without probable cause. According to her complaint, the officer who arrested her did not witness her commit a crime, did not interview the alleged victim, and did not speak with witnesses before using force. She claims the officer arrived mid-chaos, misidentified her role in the incident, and immediately treated her as the aggressor. In her telling, she was not resisting, not threatening, and not attempting to flee. Yet she says she was violently taken to the ground, restrained, and held in a patrol car for hours. That, she argues, was not law enforcement. It was punishment. Her lawsuit frames the encounter as a violation of the Fourth Amendment, which protects citizens from unreasonable searches and seizures. Under the law, an arrest must be supported by probable cause, specific facts that would lead a reasonable officer to believe a crime was committed. She claims that standard was never met, but the lawsuit goes further. She alleges excessive force, stating that the officer slammed her headfirst to the ground and applied pressure to her neck and back while she was already compliant. In legal terms, excessive force is judged by whether an officer's actions were objectively reasonable under the circumstances. Her argument is simple: if she posed no threat, then the force used was unjustified. Then there is the issue of detention. She claims she was held for 4 to 5 hours in a patrol vehicle without being promptly processed, without a judicial determination, and without a legitimate investigative purpose. According to her lawsuit, the prolonged detention was not about gathering facts. It was retaliatory. That allegation ties directly into another claim: malicious prosecution. Malicious prosecution requires showing that criminal charges were initiated without probable cause and with malice, and that the case ultimately terminated in the accused's favor. The dismissal of charges, reportedly for lack of prosecution, becomes a key part of her argument, but perhaps the most explosive claims are directed not just at the officer, but at the city of Atlanta itself. She accuses the city of approving and promoting body camera footage that, in her view, falsely portrayed her as a violent criminal. According to the lawsuit, the city released edited edited or curated footage while felony charges were still pending, shaping public perception before any court ruling. She argues that even after the charges were dismissed, the city continued to circulate the footage without correction or context, effectively branding her as a violent offender in the public eye. This forms the basis of what's known as a stigma plus due process claim, a legal theory arguing that the government damaged her reputation in a way that also altered her legal status and liberty interests, without giving her a chance to clear her name. The lawsuit also invokes Monell liability, a complex but powerful legal doctrine. Under Monell, a city can be held liable for constitutional violations only if those violations stem from an official policy, custom, or failure to properly train and supervise officers. Her claim is that the city knew, or should have known, about prior misconduct by the arresting officer and failed to take corrective action. She alleges a pattern of unconstitutional behavior that the city ignored, allowing the incident to happen. If proven, this would significantly increase the city's exposure, but proving it is no small task. On the other side, the defense is expected to push back hard. The officer will likely argue that he acted reasonably under chaotic circumstances, following his training and protocols. In situations involving crowd violence, officers often must make split-second decisions based on limited information. He is also expected to invoke qualified immunity, a legal shield that protects officers from civil liability unless they violated a clearly established constitutional right. Qualified immunity is one of the highest hurdles plaintiffs face in civil rights lawsuits. To overcome it, she must show not just that the officer was wrong, but that any reasonable officer would have known his actions were unlawful at the time. The city, meanwhile, will likely argue that even if mistakes were made, they were not the result of official policy or systemic failure. They may attempt to distance themselves from the officer's actions, framing the incident as isolated rather than institutional. There is also the issue of credibility. Before this arrest ever happened, the former judge had already been removed from office by the state's highest court, not for this incident, but for a documented pattern of misconduct. The court cited violations of judicial ethics, issues with courtroom decorum, and untruthful testimony during disciplinary proceedings. That history could loom large over the civil case. While it does not automatically disqualify her claims, it gives the defense ammunition to challenge her narrative and credibility in front of a jury. And yet, despite everything, the case raises uncomfortable questions. How much investigation is required before an arrest in a chaotic scene? When does force cross the line into excess? And what responsibility does a city have when it releases police footage that can permanently shape public opinion? This lawsuit is not just about one night outside a nightclub. It is about power, perception, and accountability. About what happens when authority collides with authority, and the system is forced to judge itself. Whether her claims ultimately succeed or fail, the case exposes the fragile balance between public safety and individual rights, and how quickly that balance can tip. Because once the cameras are rolling and the footage is released, the damage, fair or not, is often already done. And in this case, the legal battle has only just begun. As the lawsuit moves forward, the case shifts from what happened in the street to how a jury might eventually interpret it. By now, the facts are layered, the narratives are conflicting, and the stakes could not be higher, not just financially, but symbolically. At its core, this case is no longer only about an arrest. It is about power colliding with power. On one side stands a police officer, backed by a city, department policies, training manuals, and legal protections like qualified immunity. On the other stands a former judge, someone who once embodied the authority of the legal system, now claiming she was crushed by it. That contrast alone makes this case extraordinary. The jury, if it reaches that stage, will not be asked to decide whether the former judge is likable, composed, or even sympathetic. They will be asked something much narrower, yet far more difficult. Did the officer's actions cross a constitutional line? And just as importantly, did the city of Atlanta play a role in allowing that line to be crossed? One of the most challenging aspects of this case will be context. The defense will emphasize chaos, late-night crowds, alcohol, shouting, physical confrontation, and the pressure on officers to act quickly before a situation escalates further. In that environment, they will argue, hesitation can lead to serious harm. From that perspective, the officer's decision to act swiftly may be framed as reasonable, even necessary. The plaintiff, however, will argue that chaos does not erase constitutional protections. She will say that even in volatile situations, officers are required to distinguish between aggressors and interveners. She will argue that she was not fighting, not resisting, and not threatening, and that force was used against her not because it was necessary, but because it was convenient. That distinction matters, because under the law, reasonable mistakes are often protected, unreasonable actions are not. Another major factor will be body camera footage, both its power and its limits. The defense will rely heavily on it, pointing out that cameras were running, audio was captured, and the incident was documented in real time. They will argue that the footage supports the officer's version of events and contradicts claims of brutality or fabrication. But the plaintiff will counter with a different argument. That video does not tell the whole story. She claims the footage was selectively released, framed, and promoted in a way that implied guilt before any court had ruled. She will argue that tone, angles, timing, and narrative context all matter, and that the city used its authority to shape public perception in a way that damaged her irreparably. This raises a deeply uncomfortable question. When does transparency become prejudice? Police body cameras were introduced to promote accountability and trust, but in high-profile cases, they can also function as public trials, played out on social media and news platforms long before any jury is seated. If the jury believes the city knowingly allowed misleading impressions to persist, that could weigh heavily in her favor. If not, the city may argue it merely exercised its duty to inform the public. Then there is the issue of credibility. The plaintiff's past will not disappear in this case. Her removal from the bench, the findings of judicial misconduct, and the language used by the state's highest court will almost certainly be raised by the defense. They will argue that this history shows a pattern of confrontational behavior, poor judgment, and disregard for rules. But the plaintiff will likely respond with a sharp counterpoint. Past misconduct does not strip someone of constitutional rights. Even a deeply flawed person, she will argue, is entitled to lawful treatment under the Constitution, and if officers are allowed to treat people differently based on reputation or assumptions, the entire system becomes unstable. That argument has weight. Civil rights law does not protect only the innocent, the polite, or the popular. It protects everyone, or it protects no one. Another issue the jury may wrestle with is duration. How long is too long to detain someone without formal processing? At what point does an investigative stop become punitive detention? The plaintiff's claim that she was held for hours without justification could resonate, especially if the defense cannot clearly explain why that time was necessary. Yet again, the defense may argue logistics, staffing, and scene control, especially in the early morning hours. These are not simple questions, and hovering over everything is the massive $50 million demand. The size of the claim will likely shape how jurors perceive the case. To some, it may signal seriousness and scale. To others, it may feel excessive, even opportunistic. The plaintiff will argue that the amount reflects not just physical harm, but reputational destruction, loss of career, loss of credibility, and permanent public stigma. The defense will likely argue that the number is inflated, emotional, and disconnected from reality. Ultimately, jurors will be asked to separate emotion from evidence. They will have to decide whether this was an officer doing his job under pressure or an abuse of authority shielded by the system, whether the city acted responsibly or recklessly, whether the plaintiff was wronged or simply unwilling to accept the consequences of her own behavior. There are no easy answers. What makes this case so compelling is not just the footage, the lawsuit, or the personalities involved. It is the way it exposes fault lines in the justice system, between discretion and accountability, transparency and fairness, authority and restraint. Regardless of how the case ends, it leaves behind a troubling reality. In moments of chaos, truth is often fragmented, and once power is exercised, it is rarely questioned without a fight. For now, the lawsuit moves forward. The arguments take shape, and the outcome remains uncertain. But one thing is already clear. This is not just a case about one arrest. It is a test of how justice responds when those who once enforced the law claim it was turned against them. As this case stands now, there is no verdict, no settlement, and no definitive resolution, only competing narratives and unanswered questions. But sometimes, the most important stories are not about outcomes. They are about what they reveal. This case reveals how fragile the line can be between authority and accountability. On one side is law enforcement, operating in fast-moving, chaotic situations where decisions must be made in seconds. Officers are trained to control scenes, neutralize threats, and restore order, often with incomplete information. Mistakes can happen, and the law recognizes that reality by offering protections like qualified immunity. On the other side is a former judge, someone who once wielded legal authority herself, now claiming that the same system stripped her of her rights without justification. Her lawsuit argues that chaos does not excuse constitutional violations, that force must always be reasonable, and that public narratives should not replace due process. And that tension is what makes this case so compelling, because it asks questions that extend far beyond one nightclub, one officer, or one lawsuit. How much discretion should police have in moments of confusion? When does intervention become aggression? And who controls the story once the cameras are released to the public? Body camera footage meant to provide clarity instead becomes another battlefield, interpreted differently depending on perspective. To some, it shows resistance and disorder. To others, it shows escalation and excessive force. The same images tell two very different stories. Then there is reputation. Once footage circulates, once headlines are written, and once social media decides who is guilty, the damage is often irreversible. Regardless of how a case ends, charges can be dismissed, lawsuits can fail or succeed, but public perception rarely resets. That reality sits at the heart of this legal battle. The city will argue it followed policy. The officer will argue he followed training. The plaintiff will argue that policy and training failed her. If this case reaches a jury, the decision will not hinge on emotion or status. It will come down to standards, probable cause, reasonableness, and constitutional limits. The jury will not be deciding whether anyone was perfect, only whether the law was violated. And regardless of the outcome, this case leaves behind an uncomfortable truth. The justice system is strongest when it is willing to scrutinize itself. Because when authority is never questioned, trust erodes. And when rights are treated as conditional, everyone is at risk. For now, the courtroom will decide what the street could not. And the rest of us are left watching, asking where the balance truly lies between enforcing the law and honoring it.